In our day-to-day language use, we use words and numbers for different purposes. So for example, when you post a letter, on the envelope you'll write an address, which for the most part will be made up of words. On the other hand, when you make a phone call, it's more likely that you'd use a set of numbers. In programming, it's no different. There's just more categories which the data types are split up into. So when we say a data type, we are referring to the type of a specific value. So we can say that a data type defines how we will use and represent the data in our code. Some languages make you specify in advance the type of the data when you are using it, but JavaScript is what is known as a loosely typed and dynamic language. This means you do not have to specify the type in advance, because JavaScript will figure this out itself when it runs. In JavaScript, we refer to these most basic data types as primitive types, and there are 7 of these, which are as follows. Number, which is how we represent numerical values. Boolean, true or false. String, which is a set of characters. Null, undefined. And then there's also symbol and begin, which aren't as common and are slightly more advanced topics. So the first one of the primitive types we're going to look at is the number type. By using the number type, we can represent numerical values in our code. In JavaScript, there's only one type of number, but the value can be any of the following. We've got positive or negative, so 1 or -1. There's whole numbers, which are also known as integers, and these are values like 50 or 8. And then we've got decimals, which are also known as floating point values. And these are values like 10.1 or 22.8. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of these numbers. To do this, we'll use the console. If you're using Chrome, you can access this by selecting View, Developer, and JavaScript Console. So let's start by looking at positive numbers. We can simply type 1 into the console, and this would be a positive number. We can use another example and use the number 100. It works exactly the same for negative numbers. So we could do -9, and this would be a negative number, or -100, which would also be a negative number. Both these examples of positive and negative numbers are also examples of whole numbers. If we wanted to use a decimal value, such as 6.1, then we can just go ahead and type in 6.1. So now we have some familiarity of working with numbers, we can move on to look at how to perform calculations. In JavaScript, we have a set of arithmetic operators which we can use. These are addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and modulo. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of using arithmetic operators. Once again, we'll use the JavaScript console. So if we start off with addition, and we wanted to perform the calculation 2 plus 2, then we type in 2, then the addition operator, followed by 2. And as you can see, the total is returned to us, which is 4. We can do this again with subtraction. So if I wanted to subtract 2 from 10, then I type in 10, the subtraction operator, and 2. And we get 8 returned. So now let's try some multiplication, and we'll multiply 6 by 2. So I type in 6, followed by the multiplication operator, followed by 2. And as you can see, 12 is returned. We can also do the same for division. So if I wanted to divide 4 by 2, then I type in 4, followed by the division operator, followed by 2. And as you can see, 2 is returned. So lastly, let's look at the modulo operator. This operator may be the one that you're least familiar with, and it's sometimes referred to as the remainder operator. This operator will divide the value on the right by the value on the left, and then return the remaining value which is left over after the division has been performed. So if the value on the left is positive, then the return value will always be positive. If the value on the left is negative, then the return value will always be negative. So for example, if we did 8 modulo 2, we get 0. And this is because 2 goes into 8 4 times exactly, and so there's no leftover value. On the other hand, if we did 9 modulo 2, then we get 1 left over. If I wanted to see what was left if I divided 100 by 100, as this works exactly, 0 is left over. But if I do this again, but I try with 98, so I type 100 modulo 98, 98 can go into 100 once, and there is 2 left over. So the next primitive type to look at is booleans. A boolean is one of 2 values, true or false. It's much like saying yes or no, or on or off. Later in the video, when we talk about conditionals and logic, the use of Booleans will be shown in a greater depth. But for now, just remember that a Boolean is just true or false. So in the console, we can see what a Boolean looks like. If I wanted to use a Boolean with the value of true, then I simply type in true. If I wanted to use a Boolean with the value of false, then I simply just type in false. As a side note, if you ever want to clear the contents of the console, then you can call the clear method, which is a method of the console. So we just type console.clear. And because we're using a method, we use parentheses. So now we can move on to the next primitive type, which is strings. So what is a string? Well, a string is a set of characters enclosed within single or double quote marks. A string can contain anything. It doesn't have to just be text characters. But whatever characters are enclosed within the quotation marks will be part of the string. You can use single or double quotes as long as you use the same quote marks at the start and at the end of the string. Let's look at creating a string enclosed within double quote marks. So we start the string with double quote marks, and inside the string we say, my name is Bob. Then we'll end the string with another double quote mark. When we're working with strings, we can refer to each character in the string as an element. Each of these elements in the string has an index based on where in the string the element is. You can think of this a little bit like a house number, depending on where in the street the house is. The only difference with indices in strings is that they start counting from 0, so we refer to them as being 0 indexed. So if you had a string which just contained the word hello, H would have an index of 0, and the last letter in the string, which is the letter O, would have an index of 4. We'll revisit strings again a little bit later in the video. The last two of the primitive types which we're going to discuss are null and undefined. So first, let's look at null. Null represents nothing, so more simply a non-value. So for example, if your dog ate your shoe and it was no longer there, then you could set the value of your shoe to be null. In JavaScript, we usually set null intentionally. Undefined, on the other hand, also represents no value, but it's less common to assign a variable the value of undefined. Instead, undefined is more often returned to us in the form of an error, or it will be returned to us if we declare a variable, so we give the variable a name, but we do not initialize it by assigning a value to the variable. In the console, we can look at some examples of null and undefined. Using a variable, we're going to create a drink called cold drink. If we do not initialize the variable and assign the variable a value, we'll also get undefined returned. On the other hand, if we wanted to use the cold drink variable initially with no value, then we could assign null to the variable. Now when we call the cold drink variable, you can see that null is returned. So before we move on to the next section of the video, let's recap what we have just covered. We've learned that JavaScript has a set of primitive types, which represent the core data types which we can use within our code. We have looked at numbers and working with numbers using arithmetic operators. We've seen Booleans, which are true or false, and we've introduced ourselves to strings, which are a set of characters enclosed within quote marks. Then we went on to looking at null and undefined to represent non or empty values. Now we're more familiar with the basics, we can move on to working with the code a little bit more deeply. Let's start by revisiting strings.